chronicle who said every province created a ruler out of its own bowels wasn't far wrong. And all of these claimants to thrones had to find ways of legitimising themselves. For the descendants of Charlemagne, like Athelstan's nephew Louis, this was provided by their bloodline. For others, however, like the family of Duke Hugh, legitimacy was conferred by the sacramental acts of the Church. And the manuscript known as the Pontifical of Sens preserves those rights by which the Archbishop of Sens sought to legitimate his protégés. Elsewhere, other symbols of rule were employed to the same end. Anciently, amongst many of the Germanic peoples, authority had been conferred by the giving of a spear. In particular, amongst the Lombards, the nation who invaded Italy in the 6th century and set up a kingdom which stood until they were conquered in their turn by Charlemagne in the 8th century, a crucial part of the coronation ceremony had been when the king took a spear into his hand. Accordingly, in the year 922, when the Italian nobles invited Rudolph of Burgundy to become their king, one of the leading nobles, Count Sampson, presented the new ruler with a spear. And this is what it looked like. Rudolph did not enjoy his new kingdom for long. In 926, the same year in which Duke Hugh of France sent his embassy to King Athelstan, another Hugh, Hugh Count of Provence, was invited by the Italian nobles to take Rudolph's place. Hard on the heels of this setback came a demand to Rudolph from the German ruler, Henry the Fowler, to hand over the spear. Under the circumstances, Rudolph was in no position to refuse, and by complying, moreover, he acquired a powerful friend, a substantial quantity of gold and silver, and a sizable portion of what is now Switzerland. It really was an offer which he couldn't refuse. Now, we owe the record of these events to a gentleman named Liutprand, Bishop of Cremona. Liutprand had been brought up at the court of King Hugh, at which he would have seen Count Sampson, who was a major player in Italian politics in that age. In later life, Liutprand was in the service of Henry the Fowler's son, Otto the Great. And it was to Otto that Henry, in Liutprand's words, left the Lance along with the kingdom as an inheritance. Otto, the Emperor Otto the Great, was faced in 939 by a rebellion led by his younger brother Henry. Before the decisive Battle of Bearton, Liutprand tells us, Otto dismounted, knelt and prayed before the lance, upon which Henry's army turned in flight. Again, in 955, Otto bore the lance into battle when he defeated the pagan Hungarians at Lechfeld. Already in 951, Otto had conquered Italy and reportedly was crowned with the ancient Lombard crown. Finally, in 962, he was crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome. Now, Liutprand, who had evidently seen the lance with his own eyes, describes it as incorporating crosses made from the nails which were fixed to the hands and feet of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ. The lance, he reports, was said to have belonged, important way of putting it there, said to have belonged to Constantine the Great. Let's go back to that picture of the lance as it then was. Now, at this point we should probably digress briefly to consider Constantine and what Liutprand called the victory-bearing nails. According to tradition, the nails were discovered along with the wood of the cross in the year 327. In that year, the Dowager Empress Helena, that is St. Helen, the mother of Constantine, visited the Holy Land, armed with the authority of her son, to have churches built, the chief sacred sites of Christianity. The cross and nails are said to have been discovered during the preliminary excavations for the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem. There is no strictly contemporary account of the discovery, but in 351, 24 years later, Cyril of Jerusalem, writing to Constantine's son Constantius, refers to the discovery of the cross as an event of his father's reign. The story seems first to have been committed to writing by Cyril's nephew, Gelasius of Caesarea. Gelasius' own account has not survived, but it was the ultimate source of most subsequent versions, including, most importantly, those by Rufinus of Aquileia and St. Ambrose of Milan. According to this story, St. Helen gave the nails to her son. One of them was incorporated into the bridle of his war horse, and another into, and there is a slight disagreement here, Rufinus says into his helmet, and St. Ambrose says into his crown. This is not the crown of Constantine, although some people have wanted to see it as such. It is the iron crown of the Lombards, the kings of Italy before Charlemagne, and it is also the crown with which Otto the Great is said to have been crowned after his conquest of Italy. Much later, Napoleon used to use it for the same purpose. It takes its name from the narrow band of iron upon which it is based, and partly visible in this picture, which is said to have been beaten out from one of the nails of the Crucifixion. Now, the lance which Duke Hugh sent to King Athelstan was said to have belonged to Charlemagne, but not to Constantine. It did not incorporate part of the holy nails. The sword which Duke Hugh sent with the lance, however, was said to incorporate a nail, and was assigned to Constantine. The iron crown incorporating a nail has come to be attributed to Constantine, and the lance which Count Samson gave to King Rudolph, incorporating part of the nails, was also attributed to Constantine. Remembering that Liutprand says was said to have belonged to Constantine. An indication that he at least realised that the attribution was less than certain. He also makes no suggestion of any link to Charlemagne. In short, it appears that any object incorporating a part of the holy nails thereby acquires, through Gelasius' story, a connection to Constantine, and is consequently liable sooner or later to be assumed to have belonged to Constantine. We should also put at this point that Liutprand does not connect the lance itself, as distinct from the incorporated fragments of the nails, to the Crucifixion or to St. Longinus. This connection for him exists purely through the incorporated fragments of the nails. He appears to know of no connection for the actual lance, other than its reputed link to Constantine. The beginnings of another such connection, however, may have been made even in Liutprand's lifetime. Beneath the outer golden sleeve which the lance bears today is a second sheath of silver. this bears an inscription which reads, when translated, "Henry, by the grace of God, the third emperor of the Romans by that name, Augustus, commanded this silver sleeve to be made for the strengthening of the nail of the Lord and the lance of St. Maurice." This appears to be the first completely unequivocal statement that the lance had once belonged to St. Maurice, or St. Mauritius, the commander of the Theban legion, martyred for his Christianity by the Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century. The inscription must date from after Henry's imperial coronation in 1084, perhaps not long after. But there are indications that a link to St. Maurice was not a new development. As early as 1008, St. Brun of Querfurt wrote to an earlier Henry seeking aid against the heathen and asking rhetorically, "How shall the devil's Warasi," apparently a god of some of the heathen Slavs, "join with the commander of the saints, our and your Maurice? How shall the holy lance form a common front with the diabolic standards fed with human blood?" The role of St. Maurice may be traced back further. Otto the Great regarded him as his patron saint, and it is as such that he appears in this 10th century ivory carving. Standing by Otto, Otto himself is the smallest figure on the left there, and Maurice is the one directly behind him. Standing by Otto as his sponsor, as the Emperor presents the newly built Magdeburg Cathedral, which was dedicated to St. Maurice, to Christ. Even earlier, there is a late 8th century litany which invokes the particular protection of St. Maurice for Charlemagne's son Pepin, who had been appointed by his father to be king of the Lombards. And in view of the apparent Italian origins of the lance, this may not be without significance. To go further in this direction would, however, invite excessive speculation. It must be enough for us to observe that the lance was said to belong to St. Maurice at least by 1084, and perhaps by as early as 1008. From Otto's time onwards, the lance serves both as a talisman of victory and as a token of legitimate succession to the German and imperial throne. Remember, Liutprand said that Henry had left the lance and the kingdom, in that order, to Otto. It passed from Otto to his son and grandson, each of them also named Otto. When the third Otto went to Rome for his coronation in 996, as he left Germany, he had borne before him what was by now being called the Holy and Cross-Bearing Lance of Empire. And the chronicler who records this also says that this was according to custom. When Otto was again in Rome 5 years later, and revolt broke out, the emperor's outnumbered party put the lance at their head and drove the rebels before them, with the lance-bearer, Bishop Bernward, as we are told by his biographer, thundering terribly in the front rank. When Otto died suddenly a few months later, the throne was claimed by his cousin Henry. When Henry discovered that the Archbishop of Cologne had sent the lance back to Germany ahead of the dead emperor's body, he held the Archbishop's brother as a hostage until the lance had been turned over to him. He is depicted here at his coronation, lance in hand. When Henry died without an heir in 1024, the German nobles elected a successor, but it was Henry's widow, the Dowager Empress Kunigunde, herself a descendant of Charlemagne, who confirmed and legitimised their choice by presenting the lance and the other regalia to the chosen candidate, Conrad II. Perhaps the clearest indication of the significance of the lance at this period comes from its role in the life of Henry III, also known as Henry IV. There's a problem with the numbering of the Henrys in Germany at this period. But he was the emperor who engaged in the investiture controversy against Pope Gregory VII, the one who stood in the snow at Canossa. The lance was borne before him when he defeated the Saxons at the Battle of the Arnstrut in 1075. It was also borne before him at Rome when, with the Pope on his right hand and the Archbishop of Milan on his left, he processed to St. Peter's for his imperial coronation in 1084. When Henry designated his son, also named Henry, and in this picture we've got the father on the left and the son on the right, also named Henry as his successor in 1098, it was upon the lance that the younger Henry swore allegiance to his father. And when the young man nonetheless rose in rebellion in 1105, he took the greatest care that his father should be made to surrender the lance and the other regalia. A number of the older Henry's letters have survived, which allow us to know how he perceived these items and these events. Henry describes his son's oath in one letter as having been taken on the nail of the Lord with the lance. Notice that the nail is still paramount. And this, of course, agrees with the inscription on the silver sleeve. He also refers to the imperial regalia several times, and while the items which he mentions specifically vary from letter to letter, the two which always receive mention are the imperial cross, said to contain wood from the true cross, and the lance. Not even the imperial crown receives such an indication of its importance. Now at this stage, of course, the lance is still the lance of St. Maurice, not the lance of Longinus. In fact, in 1098, the year in which the younger Henry took the oath which he later broke, an alternative lance of Longinus was allegedly discovered as the result of a heavenly vision at Antioch. It enjoyed a brief celebrity amongst the soldiers of the First Crusade, until, with its discoverer failing the ordeal by fire, the supposed lance was discredited and disappeared again. It has been suggested, however, that this lance may be the relic which is venerated today in Armenia. Armenian tradition claims that it has been in that country since the time of the Apostles, but it's not attested historically before the 13th century. Our first direct and definite evidence that the Retius lance had come to be seen as the Crucifixion lance comes only in the mid-14th century. It's found on the lance itself. At this time, the lance assumed its present appearance, with the golden sleeve being added over the silver one. This was done by the command of the Emperor Charles IV. Who also had the lance enshrined in a specially built chapel within the walls of Castle Karlstein in Bohemia. The golden sleeve is inscribed Lancia et clavis Domini, the lance and nail of the Lord. Further, though somewhat equivocal testimony, for this change in perceptions comes at approximately the same time from that interesting work known as The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. Writing of the Holy Lance, the author, whether his name be Mandeville or something completely different, says that it may be found in 3 places. The spearhead, he says, is in 2 pieces, one in Paris and the other in Constantinople, both of which, let us call him Mandeville, claims to have seen. And he adds, the shaft is had by the Emperor in Germany. That he does not claim to have seen. Now, no other source claims the shaft of the lance for Germany, or for anywhere else for that matter, and it's reasonable to understand this as an attempt by Mandeville, who was probably a Frenchman, to reconcile the well-known story of the relic in the Sainte-Chapelle and its relation to the fragment in Constantinople with reports of a newer claim being made beyond the Rhine. In 1424, Charles's son Sigismund agreed to give the lance to a consortium of Nuremberg merchants who had it enshrined in the Frauenkirche, the Church of Our Lady, in that city. There it became an object of pilgrimage, with a special festival, the Feast of the Holy Lance, held each year on the second Friday after Easter, which of course is today. The lance remained at Nuremberg until the beginning of the 19th century, when, with Napoleon moving on the city, it was taken to Vienna. It remained there until 1938, when another would-be conqueror of Europe, yes, that's him, had the lance, along with the other crown jewels of the Holy Roman Empire, taken back to Nuremberg. Now, much has been said about Hitler's supposed obsession with the lance and his desire to obtain its supposed power. I regard most of this as ill-founded. From what survives of Hitler's library, which is now in the Library of Congress in Washington, his interest in these matters seems to have been much less than is alleged. Amongst the senior Nazis, it was Himmler, not Hitler, who was obsessed with the occult. It was Himmler who sent SS-supported expeditions in search of the Holy Grail, and it was Himmler who believed himself to be the reincarnation of Henry the Fowler. Hitler's motive in moving the regalia of the Holy Roman Empire to Nuremberg is likely to have been a matter of symbolism, of asserting historical continuity by moving the symbols of authority of the First Reich to the city which the annual Nazi Party rallies had turned into the spiritual centre of his Third Reich. That's enough of him. Again, we are told that at the end of the war, American forces entered Nuremberg. The lance was recovered and given to General George S. Patton, and that Hitler shot himself in Berlin an hour and a half later. It's a good story, but it's not true. Hitler shot himself on the 30th of April, but the lance was not recovered until June, and General Patton was not involved. The whole story of Hitler and the Holy Lance must in fact be regarded not as history, but as the latest stage in the developing legend of the lance. After its recovery, the lance and the rest of the imperial regalia were returned to Vienna, where they may be seen today under conditions of the highest security in the Hofburg Palace. There is, however, one more episode. In 2005, the lance was made available for examination to an English metallurgist named Robert Feather. With regard to the lance itself, his conclusions were that it could date from no earlier than the 7th century. Now, this, of course, would rule out any possibility of its having been owned by the 4th century Emperor Constantine, let alone the 3rd century St. Maurice, or a 1st century Roman soldier. The pin inserted in the head of the lance also, which had for long been regarded as a nail from the Crucifixion, was no nail at all. Under high magnification, however, the bulbous sections of the pin, marked with small brass crosses, turned out to be no parts of the actual pin, but small fragments of metal of a separate origin, which had been beaten around the pin. And we might recall that when Bishop Liutprand wrote our earliest surviving description of the lance, he described the insertion in the blade not as a nail, but as crosses made from the holy nails. And sure enough, the bulbous fragments marked with crosses were determined, after spectroscopic examination, to be consistent in their metallic composition with known examples of 1st century Roman nails of the type used in crucifixions. That's Robert Fed. That is the end of the story so far. If anyone has any questions, I will once again do my best to answer them.
Is only that the nail was
Yes.
verified as being of the right vintage.
That's right, yes.
That spear was not. The spearhead was not of that vintage. It was of the 7th century,
Right.
no earlier than the 7th century.
Could not possibly have been the lance of the Crucifixion.
It begs the question about the history of the nail, doesn't it?
It does, yes. I do actually have a theory about that, but it is highly speculative. There is absolutely no evidence to support it at all.
Well, go on then.
There is in Rome a church called Holy Cross in Jerusalem. It's built next to the remains of a high-status Roman residence, which is traditionally said to have been the palace of St. Helen. It even incorporates some of the remaining walls. It has several relics which are traditionally said to have been given to it by St. Helen, including one of the nails. Now, this nail, as it is today, is curiously blunt, as though part of the tip of it was missing. It is possible, although let me add, there is no evidence to support this, that the tip of the nail in Rome provided the metal for the cross in Vienna.
So where on that spearhead is the nail?
Now this is the pin.
Those bits are made from the nail, are they?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can see on the diagram, and there's even a copy on them if you want to have a closer look at the model, that they are marked with 2 small crosses.
Where did you get your copy from? Are we allowed to ask?
Well, it didn't come from the Hofburg. I bought it from the prop maker in Florida.
Okay, well, it looks really
Looks
great.
great.
And what became of the lance in Antioch?
Well, no one really knows, unless, as has been speculated, it is the lance that's now in Armenia. It appeared, it was there for a few months, it was discredited, then nobody wanted to know.
That to me, the picture that you showed of it didn't really look much like what I would have thought the 1st century lance to look like, particularly with the carving in the middle, which obviously been done later.
In fact, it's it's likely that that's not a true lance at all, but rather the ornamental head to a flagpole or banner or standard. What I'd really like to get a look at is the lance in Rome, and if it's ever rediscovered, the lance that was in Exeter. But I'm not expecting that to happen anytime soon.
So, refresh my memory, what happened, what was the last thing that happened to the one in Exeter?
Well, it was given to the cathedral by King Athelstan. It remained there. It can be traced in inventories of the cathedral's treasures for the next couple of 100 years. And then there's just no further mention of it.
You think it might have got lost in the Reformation?
That's the most likely scenario, yes.
So we have not one lance, but many possible lances.
Yes. We don't know what relation any of them had to the lance which Arthur saw in Jerusalem.
So we're better informed but no wiser. To quote Bernard Shaw or something.
That's about the size of it.
Can I ask, what attracted your interest to the lance?
Well, my attention was first drawn to it by the passage in William of Malmesbury. I'm primarily interested in the Anglo-Saxon period, and finding a mention of the lance in connection with one of the greatest of the kings of that period certainly aroused my attention. I think what triggered me to prepare this presentation was having seen a documentary which did an absolutely dismal job of distinguishing between history and legend.